we will try to learn how some of the ethnographic methods could be useful for analysis in English studies as well. So primarily a qualitative research strategy that relies on participant observation and concerns its most general sense with the study and interpretation of cultural behavior, right? Now, the word ethno is basically people, right? Ethnicity, like uh, in the sense of ethnicity. And graphy is a kind of measurement, right? Study. So ethnography comes from that primary word. So in this research strategy, we have a participant observer who sets herself and himself in a cultural context in any particular culture, and by observing that culture is able to interpret that particular culture. So there are two possible interventions which an ethnographic makes. So the first intervention is in the collection and analysis of the data. So it's possible that an ethnographer uh, studies the data or studies that material which has already been published on a particular culture. That is the first possible intervention that an ethnographer makes. The second possible intervention is that an ethnographer constructs the written narrative which reflects communities, and then it produces, that narrative produces certain research conclusions. So the Western ethnography, in fact, is one of the most known available ethnographic narratives. And as the literature goes, and as this chapter also hints at, some of the major ethnographic interventions which were made by the Western scholars in 18th and 19th century, right? As they traveled to different parts of the world, including parts of Africa, parts of South Asia, and these ethnographers, they were able to spend their time in these communities. They lived over there, and while living over there, they observed the culture, and then recorded their observations, and then based upon their recorded observations, they created narratives. They, in other words, they created stories, right? Not exactly a fiction story, but a story of the kind where uh, uh, they could describe in words how the culture of a particular society looked like, right? But the unique thing about their observation was this, that the observer lived in that culture or in that community as part of that culture and community, right? Uh, so the observer did not kind of try to uh, separate herself or himself from the culture, rather lived inside the culture, inside the society, and then learn, usually learns by living in the culture. So the Western, ethnographers, they become a kind of role model where they travel uh, from various countries in the West, and they spend time in the non-Western areas, and they recorded their observations. Now, when these observations go back to West, so basically once they have all those recorded notes with them, these people go back or went back to say Britain or to France or other developed countries, and they then got their observations published in the form of narratives. And because we are talking about the time when international travel was not a common thing, 19th, 18th, 19th century, once those narratives were published, the people, in their culture, in their own country, they could then read those narratives and try to understand or made an impression of or developed an impression of how a certain culture looked like. So that was the idea behind the development of this particular method. This method had lot many complications and unintended effects as well. Uh, so one of them being that while the participant observer, which is the ethnographer, lived in a certain culture, spent time over there, and developed certain impressions about that, and wrote about that, went back. The observation, even if it was highly objective, still it had a lot of subjective elements in that. Why? Because that observation was usually based on the observation of just one individual, right? So the observation of one individual kind of became the sole representation of the complex cultures, right? And the result was that the readers in the West, they in most of the cases developed incomplete or wrong impression of what these cultures look like. So what these ethnographers observed in a small chunk of society, usually it was taken to represent the whole culture of that particular land. So some of the writers, including Edward Said, they have been highly critical of the Western ethnography for precisely this reason. Because for them, these ethnographies produced more misinterpretations rather than the right interpretations. So one of the reasons that Orientalism, emerged as a particular field was precisely this, that these writers who claim to be the experts of the Orient or the experts of the East, uh, they uh, they were they were too confident about what they observed, and they thought that what sole individuals could record and could communicate to their own societies about the East, that was the whole truth. But that was not the case, right? Obviously, it could not be the case, right? But only because the West had only those few people who could represent the East for them, like South Asia or China or uh, in a different context, parts of Africa. Uh, therefore, uh, therefore, uh, as they had no other source to understand these cultures, therefore they depended on those limited, observations, ethnographic observations. So that is the root of ethnography as a discipline. So these are two possible, interventions that ethnographers make, right? They interpret the existing data, uh, or they read the existing data and then they reinterpret in a new way. And the second intervention is that they go live in a particular culture and they construct a narrative based upon that. Okay, and then read certain conclusions. Now for you students, in this course, the second intervention probably is not possible for you, okay, as students of literature. Technically speaking, the department does not actually support this kind of research at all, because it has its own uh, limitations, it has its own risks, and then it also has its own methodology, right? Which in many ways go beyond the scope of English studies as well, right? Uh, So that I think that is the major reason uh, for the English majors not to indulge in the second kind of intervention. But the first intervention, that is always possible, right? So so basically what you do is we are going to down to the English, the ethnography for English studies, but just before that, sorry. So I already explained this point that is a mode of research. Ethnography is a mode of research whereby you conduct your research in a natural setting, right? Not in artificial setting, right? As the culture exists, right? So, for example, I know some people who work on the you know the the traditional families in Lahore, the traditional uh, singers families in Lahore. Okay, though the families, traditional families uh, who play music and produce music and perform it, right? As a kind of ancestral enterprise, right? So I know some people who conduct research who have done ethnographic research on that. So basically, they had to spend their time with those families for a certain time period, right? In order to write a narrative about that. Okay, so you have to be very well connected. You have to be very well resourced, right? Because while in that particular time period you are living with those families, somebody need to provide all of your needs as well, right? And then you need to be well connected because those people are not going always going to trust you, right, while you spend time with them. So there are challenges of that kind. uh, there are other cultures as well, in parts of the country which are not well explored, and they still need to be explored, so people go spend time with them. uh, some people work on the communities of transgenders in Pakistan. Okay, again, very very challenging work, right? Uh, because you have to fight against the social stigma, and uh, uh, you have to take the risk, right? Is a major risk, because those communities are already vulnerable, and once you start spending time with them in order to observe their culture, you put yourself in the risks way, in the way of the risk. And then lastly, it's very hard to gain the trust of a particular community. So probably they won't let you do this research at all, right? So challenges of this kind, right? So basically, as a student of English literature, you do not engage with the second intervention of living in the culture and observing that, right? Still, what you do is, as student of English literature, the kind of ethnography you engage in is this. As students of English literature, if you are interested in conducting research on ethnographic method or using ethnographic method, your best option is to read ethnographies written by other writers. Okay, uh, so while you read them, you provide your analysis. So, for example, one way can be, if you are working on uh, a 19th century British novel, any particular novel uh, of a particular time period, you might claim that you are going to do an ethnographic analysis of that particular novel. In order to execute that ethnographic analysis, you will be reading the ethnographies of that particular region to which the novel also belongs. So you will read the published ethnographies of that particular region in that particular time period. And through your analysis of the literary text of the novel, you will be reflecting on the representation of that particular culture in the fiction, in novel. Okay, now how will you know what kind of culture existed in that particular society in that particular time period? Of course, you will get to know about that from your reading of ethnography, because ethnography precisely is the representation and record of the culture of a particular region in a particular time period. So you will use that material in order to analyze a literary text. So you might have an argument of this kind, whether or not a particular literary fiction is an accurate representation of a particular culture. So essentially, you will be doing what we call a comparison. So it will be a comparison between what you find in the ethnographic book, in the ethnography, and what you find in the literary text. Now, there could be a huge variety of cultures, right? So, for example, there could be the culture of religious people, religious communities, maybe life of church, right, represented in a particular novel. There could be the community of lawyers, like, right, lawyers, or there could be a community of singers, you know. So there are so many aspects of the culture, right, represented in a particular novel. It could be, a community of scholars, or it could be the culture in general, you know. So there are a lot many ethnographies which have been written about the uh, religious representations, okay, both in the East and the West, right? So there is a huge possibility of, so in order to engage with ethnography as a method, you have to be very cautious in choosing the primary text and your secondary text, right? So your primary text would be a literary text, and you will be then looking for an ethnographic representation of the same culture to which that particular primary text belongs, right? So you cannot randomly pick a text. You will have to, uh, you know, kind of try and error, right? So you will choose a literary text and then see if that text actually represents a particular culture at all. If it is about that, if yes, then you have to look up for the available ethnographies. Did anybody conduct an ethnographic study of that particular region in that particular time period? If yes, then probably you can start that research. If no, then you will have to look for another literary text, right? But the literary text will remain the primary focus for you. First of all, you need to find that, and then an ethnographic study, and then a comparative study of the ethnography and the literary text. Okay, in order to establish whether or not a literary text is a true representation of that particular culture. All right. So this is the way for you to